Here. Welcome to our Cannon Valley Master Naturalist chapter and also to the Southeast Minnesota Prairie Partners chapter, Wild Ones, who's co-hosting tonight. Barb Bolin is here from there, and she'll be recording and be our co-host tonight. Um, this is all being run through the Zoom of the Master Naturalist program at the U of M. So Amy Rager from Master Naturalist is there in the background. Our plan for the evening is to go straight to our speaker tonight, Michael Worland, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers, and then around 7:20 or so, our Master Naturalist chapter has a little bit of business to do to elect officers for the year. So we'll move to that at about 7:20. And those of you who aren't interested in that piece of business, if you're here from Wild Ones or other corners, you'll be free to hop off at that point. Um, so we're pleased to have Michael Worland tonight. He has been a wildlife biologist with the Minnesota DNR with their non-game wildlife program for 10 years, stationed out of Mankato, but lives in Northfield. And I think some of us on this call may have interacted with him this past summer as they were doing some insect survey in Northfield and in some of our county yards. In other adventures in Minnesota, he's helped lead research on habitat use of reptiles and the bull snake and the common five-lined skink in Minnesota, and led work to monitor grassland birds in western Minnesota, and recently has been monitoring migrating birds using audio recordings. So lots of different experiences. We particularly asked him, though, to speak tonight on the prairie monitoring of bumblebees and butterflies and the pollinator communities, particularly in more urban, if you can call Northfield urban, habitats, the habitats that many of us have been trying to create in our own yards. So thanks, Mike, for joining us tonight. This will be recorded for later, and whenever you need to share a screen, if you want to share data, you should be able to do that.
Okay, we'll do right away here.
Oh, and I'll just say, if folks have questions along the way, you can put them in the chat, but we will take questions near the end. So just feel free to put those in there for now, but know that we won't respond to chat questions until after the end of the presentation.
Okay, screen look okay?
Looks great.
Well, thanks so much for having me, you guys. I'm really happy to be here. This is a topic that I get excited about. It's a really pleasure to talk about it. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I'll break it into roughly three parts. The first part is just kind of set the context, talk about why I think this is important work. Secondly, then I'll kind of present results from that little project I ran this summer. And then thirdly, I will delve into a little more detail about what I think are important considerations for these urban native plantings. Um, and by the way, I've had a trouble coming up with terminology to describe this thing. What do we call them? Native plant gardens, native plantings, native urban habitat. I don't know what we call it yet, so I'm struggling with that. But you'll hear me use all those terms. I'm referring to the same thing, and basically that's people, you and I, homeowners typically, right? Um, Trying to restore habitat in their yards is mostly what I'm talking about. Urban habitat could include things like parks that are bigger and have a lot of potential, of course. But today I'm really emphasizing yards. And part of the reason for that is so my wife and I bought our first home in 2020. And even though we're getting well into middle age, we've been renters our entire lives. And so for the first time, we had a yard that we get to make decisions about what to do there. And it was exciting and fun. And my wife has become obsessed about it. even more than me. Um, yeah, so we just saw lots of benefits, right? It's beautiful. I think it's much more beautiful than a big green space. I realize that's a subjective opinion, but um, it's requires a lot less mowing, of course. I'm convinced that's a drawback for a lot of people. They like to mow, and I don't understand that, but it's true. Um, they certainly require less chemical inputs, though I would argue that even a regular lawn should require very little, if any, chemical inputs. But so all these things, and then yeah, like I said, they're fun. Um, but there's also this idea of habitat, that they provide habitat, and so that's an idea that's taken a little getting used to for me. This is what I think of when I think of as habitat. For my entire career in Minnesota, this is what I've worked in. So when I think of habitat, this is what I think of. The big prairie out west, or the western part of the state, or the big forest up in the northern part of the state. That's what I think of. So for that reason, it's been kind of a challenge for me to come around to this idea. But I'll tell you what's helped me come around to this idea is evaluating this habitat, evaluating what I call big reserves, habitat reserves, habitat that's basically set aside for which biodiversity and wildlife is the primary objective. And so the question is this doing enough? And how many resources should we be investing in this, if any? Um, this is the more conventional historical way we've approached habitat conservation, by looking at these big reserves and working in them. And so we kind of have to justify doing something else. The burden of the evidence is on doing something else. So some of the work I've been involved in has done just that. I'm going to talk about birds for a second, even though the emphasis of our talk is about pollinators. I want to talk about birds because we have some of our best data sets are for birds. So this shows the grasshopper sparrow. This is using breeding bird survey data. So it's a monitoring effort that occurs across the state, in all sorts of different habitats. Right, it just goes across the state, and so that is finding a -6% per year decline. So to give you an idea of that decline, sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around what these figures mean. A 7% per year decline means a population is getting cut in half in a 10-year period. So it's a steep, serious decline. And this is not unusual. A lot of these grassland birds are showing these declines. So we in the DNR have a monitoring effort focused exclusively in protected prairies at relatively high quality, and we've been doing it now for 18 years. I haven't been involved the entire time. And what we're finding is very similar declining population trends in these reserves. So that it surprised me to some extent. I figured either the populations would be stable, or hopefully declining less in these reserves, because it's this good stable habitat, right? But they're declining there just like they are everywhere else. So to me, it's a sign that there's other things we need to be doing in that surrounding area. And of course, to be fair, when you're talking about birds, it's not just the surrounding area. You're talking about globally, because these birds migrate and overwinter down south, right? So there's all sorts of things going on with them. To focus more on pollinators, so we don't have as good of a data set for them, but we do have some patterns that are meaningful. So prairie skippers, these are little butterflies that require prairie for habitat. And so 10 to 20 years ago, fairly recently, all these species occurred in Minnesota. Some of them were fairly uncommon, but they all occurred here. Some of them were fairly common. And so now the situation is that 6 out of those 10 are gone. They're extirpated from the state. And the remaining 4 are sparse and really have local, are really uh, uh, really restricted as far as their distribution. So this is a little misleading, me talking about this, because I wouldn't expect any of these butterflies to be in somebody's backyard, but they're a good indication of these prairie reserves and how much we can depend on them to conserve biodiversity. And so all the answers or all the arrows at this point are pointing to the direction of we have to be careful about depending too heavily on them. We need to be working elsewhere. And that's where this urban backyard habitat comes in. So okay, I've been giving you lots of gloomy news. I'm going to give you one more piece of gloomy news. Oh, I'm sorry. Two more pieces of gloomy news. I'm sorry about that. Um, yeah, so I have a prairie bias, obviously, because I work in the southern part of the state. I know most of you live down here too, so you may have the same bias. But across habitats, we are seeing patterns that are showing that insects are having trouble. So here's a couple. Almost a quarter of pollinators have an elevated risk of extinction. A good half of the native bee species with sufficient data are declining. With sufficient data is an important qualifier because it's a tiny proportion of all the bees that have sufficient data. So we know native, and so a lot of those species, I'm sure, are also crashing, but we don't have the data to show it, right? So yeah, these are alarming trends. I will urge people to think about. You've probably seen some of these headlines for insect apocalypse and that kind of thing. I urge you to have some skepticism when you hear those things. I don't think it pays for us to use that kind of language, honestly, if the data don't justify it. They insects are doing fine in some areas. Certain species are doing fine, but a lot of species are in big trouble, and so that is an important story for us to tell. So that brings about the question of why, a very natural question. Um, Habitat loss, of course, we know is a big factor for these things. Throughout the prairie region, the tallgrass prairie region in the central United States, 4% of the remnant prairie remains. In Minnesota, 1 to 2% of the prairie remains, and this is probably stuff you all are familiar with. It's important to emphasize that even where the prairie has been removed, some of that habitat has been restored. It's an important distinction to make. I mean, the prairie basically, as soon as that plow bites into the soil, for all intents and purposes, that prairie is destroyed forever. And the reason for that is because it destroys the soil ecosystem. And it takes centuries or even millennia sometimes to rebuild that soil. But you can restore habitat in certain respects. It can function as habitat for certain species through restorations. So that's happening. However, we shouldn't let that get us too optimistic because some of that habitat is also getting destroyed. So in basically the last 12 years, from roughly 2012 to 2023. So over that 12-year period, we lost 30 million acres of grassland to cultivation. So this is converting grasses to row crops. I superimposed Ohio over that because it's about 30 million acres. So that shows you what we've lost in a 12-year period there. So we're still losing habitat. I quite often think about it as something that happened to my grandfather and grandmother, grandparents, and their farms. No, it's happening now. So, and then we also have pesticides, of course. So that pesticide use has really ramped up with technology in the past couple of decades. We know it's a major factor for these insects. The bottom bullet there shows insecticide-coated soybean seed for 65% of farmers. Interestingly, I could not find that same stat for corn, but I think from what I've read, it's probably much higher for corn. So these pesticides are ubiquitous out there in the landscape, and we don't have solid data showing us what the population level impact is of those pesticides. But there's good reasons to hypothesize that it's significant. And at this point in time, it may be even more significant than habitat loss, honestly. Okay, so now here's where I tell you I've been giving you lots of gloomy news. I have one more bit of gloomy news, and that's that we have 785,000 acres of turf grass in Minnesota, basically of lawns, basically. But it includes things like parks and sports fields and stuff like that. So it's gloomy on one hand. It sounds bad on one hand, but on the other hand, this is what gets me kind of excited. Um, Here we got 785,000 acres of stuff that's just sitting there being green, and it could be turned into habitat. And so that kind of gets me excited. To give you an idea of the scale of that 785,000 acres, it's over 3 times the amount of remnant prairie we have in the state. So yeah, that gets me excited. It does have kind of an inherent constraint, and that is when we talk about our yards, especially by definition, unless you're wealthy and you have a giant yard, um, they're probably going to be smaller. They're going to be smaller. They're going to be less connected to the prairie out in the landscape. And so, just as a kind of a little facetious story here, my wife and I planted some native plants in our front yard, and I was like, okay, get ready, build it and they will come. We're going to get some species out here. This never happened. We never got this, and so it makes sense, right? You're not going to get a prairie chicken in your little native planting in your front yard. But I wondered about insects, and because they're smaller, they may be less sensitive to area and connectivity constraints. Some species. So I focused on pollinators. There's been a lot of focus on pollinators in the insect world. A reason for that, of course. Oh, let me back up for a second. Just define what a pollinator is. It's any animal that transfers pollen from the male parts of one plant to the female parts of another plant. They all basically do it accidentally, while they're gathering food. Um, I focused on butterflies and on bees. These are the species we've also focused on in all of our prairie monitoring that we've been doing the last several years. Butterflies mainly because they're charismatic species that people know that if people are familiar with, so they're a good flagship kind of species for conservation. And of course, we do know that there are several butterfly species that are imperiled and that are declining. And then bees we focus on, they are the superstars of the pollinators. They're by far more efficient pollinators than any of the other animals you see on the screen. They have body parts that are designed to carry large volumes of pollen. So they transfer huge volumes of pollen relative to these other species. And they also they're specialists. Or about roughly a third of those bees are specialists, meaning they go from they travel from one plant to the other that are the same species. So the other pollinators could be mixing it up and visiting all kinds of species. Those specialist bees are sticking to one species or a few different ones, and so they're very efficient for that reason. Another reason pollinators are getting a lot of press for their importance is because of their importance for our food economy. So, you look at this image, coffee and chocolate. You had me at coffee and chocolate. That's all I had to hear, and I'm pro pollinator. Uh, but yeah, there's a whole suite of foods that they are responsible for. Um, it's worth emphasizing again, kind of like the insect apocalypse thing, that this has been overstated a little bit in the press. Um, some of our major agricultural crops, corn and soybeans, for example, wheat, they don't require animal pollination. So, yeah, there's no doubt they're important for our food, and if they went away, we'd be in trouble in that regard. There's no doubt that they're absolutely essential for our native habitat. And so when I'm talking about habitat, even if a person doesn't care about pollinators or any wildlife at all, this native ecosystems are supplying all sorts of valuable functions that we care about. Water quality, water storage, carbon sequestration, a beautiful, interesting landscape. All of these things, just about everybody cares about. And those would absolutely disappear without pollinators. So going back to my original question of should we, the title of this talk, should we monitor urban pollinators? The more specific question I'm asking to get at that is this question here. Do bee and butterfly species of greatest conservation need use native plantings in Northfield? So I species of greatest conservation need is kind of an awkward mouthful. It's a term from our Minnesota Wildlife Action Plan. And so basically for my job, I need to be working with species of greatest conservation need. I have to before I can really justify doing it. And so it's a pretty broad net that's cast uh, to deal with species that have some level of imperilment. They're declining or they're important for some reason. Yeah. Um, the other thing that's worth pointing out here is why I focused in Northfield. So to be very upfront, one reason is that I live in Northfield. The other reason is that Northfield does have a pretty strong community of native plant enthusiasts. Lots of people are planting native plants in their yards here in town, more than I've seen elsewhere. And the city does a good job of planting native plants in the parks around town. The Carleton College Arboretum is also on the edge of town that has some nice larger prairie reconstructions. So my part of my thinking is Northfield makes a good case study, and if the native plantings here are providing habitat, if it's happening anywhere, it ought to be happening here in Northfield. Yeah, so just really a very brief, quick effort to kind of get my feet wet on this question. To call it a pilot is almost an overstatement, but 13 yards. Plus, I surveyed one of those reconstructions on the edge of town, kind of almost as like a control, and just for a little over 14 hours of total surveying. So just really over a few days. So just a quick summary of our results, just to kind of give you a taste of what we saw. The bar height in this graph shows the number of sites that where we found each of these species. You can see we found 8 bumblebee species, 12 butterfly species, and 11 solitary bees, again, all in just a little over 14 hours of surveys. The solitary bees, so these are non-bumblebee bees. That's what we're talking about with solitary bees. You'll notice it's quite a few of them, most of them, we don't actually identify the species. The vast majority of these solitary bees, you have to have a specimen in a lab where you're inspecting some, microscopic characteristic to get into the species. So which we don't do. We don't have the funding or the time to do that, or for me, the expertise. So we do everything in the field. And then also honeybees, I wanted to point out, I'm sure most of you are aware, they're not a native bee, even though they get a lot of press. They're not a native bee. In fact, in Minnesota, they're technically regulated as a livestock species. So we don't emphasize them, though they are important members of the community. So just to go through some individual results for some of these species of greatest conservation need, the monarch butterfly, you all are familiar with that species. It's been proposed as a federally threatened species, I believe. It's now on hold, but it has officially met criteria for federal listing. And it's a very common occupant of these native plantings in yards. I believe we found it in 10 of the 14 yards. So I think it's good news for the monarch. Rusty patch bumblebee, you all have heard of this one. It's our federally endangered bumblebee. Northfield's kind of a hot spot for them. I didn't find one in the yards in that 14 hours of surveying. I did find one in that reconstruction on the edge of town. We know they're in the area. We know they use yards a lot. So the fact that I didn't find one in yards doesn't really concern me. They are there. This one, the American bumblebee, was an interesting one. This is one I kind of had questions about, like would they use these native plantings in town? We found one in the reconstruction, but then we also found one in a fairly small planting in town. And one thing that's worth pointing out about that, so it was pretty small. I guessed it was approximately 170 square feet. So that's like 13 feet by 13 feet. That native planting, but it was adjacent to a whole string of native plantings along the boulevard strip. I think there were four different homeowners in a row that all had native plantings, and it was at the end of that row. So to me, it really is a good example of how you can have fairly small plantings in town, but when you get a bunch of neighbors growing them together, that might make a difference. It probably will make a difference. You're essentially increasing the area and the connectivity of that habitat. And this is going towards showing that, demonstrating that. So one we didn't observe that I hope to observe at some point in town in these yard plantings is the yellow bumblebee. We found one in the reconstruction. I found one there a couple of years ago in kind of an informal survey. But yeah, I've yet to find one of those in town. So a regal fritillary is another species that's been proposed to be federally listed. I don't really expect to ever get this in somebody's planting in town. Okay, but it's worth showing here just to emphasize again that even though these yard plantings can have a lot of insects and really have a high diversity of insects, there's always a subset of these species that require prairie, and so we can't ever ignore that, and we can't ever go into nothing but like urban habitat. Not that I don't think that would ever happen, but there's always going to be a need for prairie to protect species like the regal fritillary. Some other species we did not observe: Xenoglossa albata. So this is another solitary bee, a species of greatest conservation need. This is one, this is an example of one that we'd like to see in town, particularly because it's a host, it's a specialist bee. Its host plant here is a purple prairie clover. They so they require clovers, dahlia of the genus dahlia. So part of our idea here, particularly my colleague Jessica Peterson, this is kind of her idea. It is her idea. If we plant more of these host plants, including in towns and yards, can we start drawing some of these species in and increasing their numbers? And so it's an interesting question that I'll talk about a little bit more. Another example is Colides andrewsi. They require prairie alum root. Heuchera is the genus. The species is not coming to me, but yeah. So this is another one we'd like to see at some point in a yard planting, but we haven't yet. But yeah, if folks will plant more of these plants, it'll be an interesting question to see if these bees come in. So talking about these specialist bees, part of what I want to do is emphasize them going forward and looking at how they respond to these host plants. Like if we have these host plants in these urban plantings, do we see those bee species? And so this is a list of some of those species. It's a small list, and the reason it's such a small list is um, because these are species that we can probably identify in the field. And so there's a lot of other specialist bees that you can plant certain plant species for. Those resources there on the right will help you get to those plants if you're interested in doing that. I think it's a good strategy to make your native plantings more effective. Is to make sure you have some of these species in there that are required by certain bees. So going back to the title of the talk, my answer to that question is yes. That is probably not surprising, but it is. I took this question very seriously because there's lots of monitoring needs everywhere, and every day I spend monitoring pollinators in somebody's yard is a day I'm not spending monitoring in a prairie reserve, and so it is a meaningful, important question to ask. But I said yes because we are finding species of greatest conservation needs in yards with fairly high frequency. There's just lots of unanswered questions, like the solitary bee species, for example. Will they use these yard plantings? And then just the pure potential that we're talking about here, 785,000 acres. If we can get even a fairly small proportion of that converted to habitat, the bang for buck there could be could be great. So 2026 plans, I want to expand to a few more yards. I have, just given my capacity right now, I still am kind of treating this as a pilot, but I'm going to get it and treat it as more of an expanded pilot. Um, I want to include more of these, have more of a focus on some of these solitary bees, and continue working with the homeowners. So talking about working with homeowners, I've got maybe 10 more minutes. Is that okay, or how are we doing on time? Can anybody tell
That's
me that?
great. Keep going.
Be okay? Okay. So just to be clear here, we're getting into an area after this that is not my area of expertise. Like I said, we got this house 5 years ago, and I just kind of started learning about how to restore habitat in my yard. So it's not, I'm not an authority on this, but I do want to talk about it. There's we can't be too glowing and optimistic about urban native habitat without talking about some of these caveats. And so the idea of ecological traps, if you're not familiar with that, we're talking about a situation where you're drawing wildlife into habitat, and then because of something that they haven't had time to evolve a defense for, um, they're dying in that habitat, or they're getting killed by something that we humans put there. And so a key example of that is pesticides, and there's good reasons to have a lot of concern about them. So we have a lot of concern on the agricultural landscape. It's at least as equally concerning in town. So here's one study. Looked at Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Sacramento, California. In both places, around 93% of these host plants were contaminated with pesticides. So an alarmingly high percentage, and really opens up the possibility for these ecological traps. Also, when it comes to pesticides, I used to always think of insecticides as being the real problem. They are, after all, designed to kill insects. Herbicides also, though, there's more and more research coming out showing how they can impact these critters. So glyphosate, which is Roundup, has been shown to have adverse impacts on the gut bacteria of various pollinator species in this study and in a few others. So good reasons to be concerned about herbicides. And then also another issue that's coming up more and more in the literature is light pollution. Can potentially impact pollinators, both nocturnal and diurnal, actually. So these are important considerations for urban habitat, and it's not all just about planting native plants. We got to think about these things to really make sure we're not doing more harm than good with these native plantings. The other consideration is particularly for bees is their nesting habitat. So on the left here, you see ground nesters. That's the majority. I think about 2/3 of our bees, of our native bees, are actually nest in the ground as solitary bees, and they require fairly open or at least sparsely vegetated ground, and usually sandier soil. So it can be an issue in these yard plantings because they tend to be compacted, from all the traffic and people walking and machinery and everything. And so, in construction, yeah, they just, every time dirt gets dug up and moved, it gets more and more compacted. So it's a concern in our yards. And then stem nesters, of course, as well, and then cavity nesters. Most of our bumblebees are cavity nesters. They use an existing cavity that goes into the ground. And so making sure that some of these nesting habitats are in your yard is important. to avoid an ecological trap. So just quick take-home points that are hopefully easy to remember, to think about for our native plantings. Number one, no pesticides. Number two, think about artificial light. If you got an artificial light in your backyard that's yours, turn it off. We, uh, it's not worth it, in my opinion. The the questions are when you have neighbors that have lights or when you have street lights. But there, I would just urge you to think about the placement of your native plantings relative to those things. And then this idea of working with neighbors to build native plant complexes, um, it really increases the bang for buck from your native planting. Emphasizing species diversity in your native plants, and in particular, making sure that you have a number of plants blooming throughout the entire season. So this is especially important early in this season. That's quite often when these flower resources are limited for these pollinators. Fifth, try planting some of these host plants that are required by certain species that we've talked about. And then six, make sure they're a suitable nesting habitat. So a lot of nuances there that I'm not an expert in, and that we're kind of glossing over. Those nuances, you could find some of those here. I'm sure you all are aware of other resources that maybe you can throw in the chat. But these have impressed me. If you want to go to these resources again to cover some more of those details about how to optimize your plantings. So yeah, I want to acknowledge some people I've worked with. On the left there, we had a really good day with some DNR colleagues and Nancy Breaker, who's the Carleton College Arboretum director. She joined us for that day, so that was a lot of fun. And we talked to homeowners, hopefully some of which are on the call, and yeah, that was fun. And then also some DNR colleagues, bee experts, joined me in the field. So to be clear, I don't consider myself to be an insect expert. I've been surveying them now for 5 years, and I'm learning a lot. But when it comes to it's a lifelong journey becoming a real expert in these things, because they're so diverse and there's just so many of them. But yeah, so I can rely on these experts. I have good access to them. I take a lot of photos of these insects and send them off to these folks, and they help me identify them. So it's been a really good relationship. The most important partners to acknowledge here are the homeowners. They've been so awesome, and really the probably, I talked about the 785,000 acres and how that gets me excited. But as much as anything, it's these homeowners that have this habitat. They get me excited, and their enthusiasm is very infectious. So yeah, that's all I have. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me with questions, especially about insect monitoring. And if you get to me with some questions about specifics of your habitat restoration in your yard, I'll at least refer you to the right place.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Um, we have about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. And we've got a few things already in the chat. A couple that are just large scale. Can you remind us of the timing and frequency of the counts, like uh,
Yeah,
when these took place, and was it just one in each spot or two times or that kind of thing?
I glossed over the methodology, and that was part of the deal with this year because it was I didn't have a real strict methodology. Um, Most of the sites I went to twice, and that was sometime probably late July through early September. And I probably spent, rough approximately, give or take, it varied considerably, but somewhere around an hour in somebody's yard each time I did that. So yeah, that's part of what I want to do next season is develop a more fixed protocol that will help me make some comparisons between different sites.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
and also with methodology, mainly I use my camera, and I actually didn't capture very many insects. Um, I have a pretty good camera, and I've gotten pretty skilled at just taking pictures of animals on the plant, taking a bunch of pictures and using those for identification. Though I can use nets. I am permitted to use them. You have to have a permit to use them, but as at least as a public employee because of the rusty patch bumblebee. But
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. And the reconstruction you were talking about, where was that again?
Oh, well, it was a Carleton University
Ah, okay.
Arboretum
In,
reconstruction.
in the Arboretum. Okay.
I think I said it was one on the. I think it was one of the ones I said was on the edge of town. Yeah, that was their arb. Yeah,
Okay. Okay. Question, didn't look for wasps in particular or
I did.
okay.
Yeah, I didn't focus on them in my results. I don't.
Okay.
Um, they weren't a big focus, but I certainly took lots of photos of them and did try to account for their diversity. I didn't identify them as species, but wasps and moths as well.
Hmm.
Ideally, those would be something I would expand to in the future. Beyond bees and butterflies. But bees are going to be enough of a challenge for me to incorporate into this monitoring, and so I'm trying to do one step at a time here.
Yeah. Question, did the 12 butterfly species include any of the skippers you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation?
No, it included, I think, a couple of different skipper species, but none of the ones at the beginning. Those were all prairie obligates. Um, Again, those species I would be very surprised to ever find in somebody's yard. It would be worth having a party about. The Yeah, we found a couple of skippers, but none of those.
Okay. And Barb wants to know if you recorded specifically which plants a pollinator was on.
I didn't this year. I think I don't. We'll see about 2026, but in at some point going forward, I would like to have more of a plant assessment to see what species are growing in a in a in a restoration in somebody's yard.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it'll be an important point. But I didn't look specifically at, and that might be pretty simple data to collect, and it's a good idea that we ought to try doing going forward. Um, it's just everything takes time. You do one thing, and it means doing less of something else. So
yeah,
we have to kind of be thoughtful about that. But that would be an easy data point to collect what the species of plant is.
great. Michael, I might suggest you stop sharing your screen for a second so we
Sure.
can see each other. And Nancy wanted to share a little bit about the homeowner efforts.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Hey, everybody. Mike, that was so great. Thank you for sharing with us what you did.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Um, I just wanted to mention how um, Mike talked about like these strings of plantings along boulevards and clusters around the city, which really is what might build pollinator populations so that you can actually find them and have decent populations. But a lot of that got started, not all of it, but a lot of it with an effort that between Barb Boland and Nancy Schumacher, who are both here, and a few other people who I'm forgetting right now. We applied for and got a large grant through the Lawns to Legumes program. And then we recruited landowners um, to provide mini grants to, and we chose them by ones that were near each other because we knew that this habitat connectivity was really important. And so we found clusters of people around town that were willing to put in these pollinator gardens. But we also know there are a lot of other people around town who have funding from Lawns to Legumes. So I just want to put in that plug um, for that program to continue. It's small amount of money, but can make a big difference for a homeowner to have a few $100s to do the work. And I think we can keep building on some of those projects.
Nancy, is there a different lawns to legumes grant for groups of land homeowners? Is that right?
It was one that could go to like cities or ours actually ran through the Rice County NRCS, no, SWCD. They were the actual applicant, but we put together the project and they submitted it. And then when we did the paperwork, then they paid the landowners.
I
So
think it
there are
was
these
called
larger.
neighborhood grants. I think it was
Mhm.
neighborhood. They were all individual homeowners, like Bill Jokela on the call here. But it was all in a town or a city.
Mhm. Right. Right. But so we were just an informal group of people interested in native plants and pollinators. And we found a partner in the Rice County SWCD to be the recipient of the money and help us with the administration of it.
Mike, one thing our Wild Ones chapter does is we do have something similar to that one now. We have native planting grants that we give. We don't do anywhere near as many, but like 5 of them or so, and individual homeowners in southeastern Minnesota can get those. And we just require native plants put in. So we are trying
Nice.
to expand on what, and lawns and legumes, you can still apply for them too.
Sure.
But
Amy just put the link to the current Lawns and Legumes program in the chat. So if anyone's interested, that link is there. Other questions? I think we covered everything that was in the chat, unless if anyone wants to restate their question if I misrepresented it.
There was a comment from Amy Rager in the chat asking Mike if you've ever thought about how the Minnesota Master Naturalist volunteers could potentially help you with monitoring.
Yeah, that's a really good question and something I should think about if you all think there'd be interest. Yeah, the pollinator surveys, they are challenging, especially for people that are new to it, like I have been. But they are fun. Yeah, like I've got a $1,500 camera. That seems to be pretty important, unfortunately, for me to be able to do it. And then, yeah, if you're going to catch them, you got to have a permit to do that. So there was kind of complicating factors involved. But if we can if those are hurdles we can overcome, I think there'd be it could be a great opportunity. The other thing to consider is that, and that maybe your guys' input on this would be valuable, but I've been a little bit reluctant. I don't want to be not dragging, that's a negative verb. I don't want to be bringing in a whole group of people into these people's yards. It sometimes it makes me feel a little nervous. So I like to keep the group small, 1 or 2 or 3 people. But that's not an excuse for avoiding volunteers. 1 or 2 of those people that come with me could be volunteers. And yeah, I don't know. It's worth thinking about more.
We had a couple more minutes for questions before we move to our business meeting. Anybody else want to?
Well, I would just state that if for volunteers in Northfield, you're going to have a lot of folks interested.
Yeah.
So when you're ready, don't hesitate to reach back out and say, I'd love to have a volunteer or 2 during this time frame, and
Okay.
and see how we can help. I know some of us have been trained on the Atlas bee, that sort of thing, and I know Barb Boland knows more about bees than I will ever know. So
don't
there's a
give me so
lot
much
of good
credit.
people.
I'm not that good,
Yeah.
but I would love to help.
Right. So, so however you think we can fit in, we're happy to do it.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Mike, this is Amy Rager with the Master Naturalists program. Remember, I was just gonna lurk in the background and work, but if I didn't. I listened to everything you said.
Oh, good.
Because dang, it's all too interesting. But I think you be bold and get over your fear of volunteers.
Well,
I mean, I know I understand all the hangups. Believe me, I know all about them. But I think you'll find that you'll be glad you did. And as long as you're driving, so you make the rules, say the only 2 people in somebody's yard at a time, no more than that. And you got to have a good camera. I mean, make the rules and people will follow them and be more than happy to help you.
Yeah, I will definitely put more thought into this. I think yeah, the opportunities there are in, we're always looking for outreach opportunities, and so having people volunteer working with you in the field. I mean, this is one kind of outreach, what we're doing now, but my bias is that the most effective outreach is when people are working with me in the field. So I will think more about that. The um, there, yeah, there. Well, for example, we're talking about identifying plants and doing a plant survey in these yards while we're doing these surveys. So that would be more data that a volunteer could help me collect, for example. That could be really useful. Yeah, and you're right. If I'm talking to a homeowner, I can ask them how they feel about people walking through their yard. If they and we can be upfront about it. Yeah,
Well, we could always do a iNaturalist bio blitz type thing here in Northfield. So I feel like they get to do those in the cities. We should be able to do them here.
I like that idea, BioBlitz. Yeah. I will just add one comment about this idea of neighbors working together. I mean, even if you're an introvert like me, and you don't want to go out and try to recruit neighbors to join you in your native plantings, there's no doubt I'm seeing it in our yard and elsewhere. When somebody plants native plants in their front yard or in the boulevard, and they put a sign there, make it look nice. That is infectious, and it does spread to neighbors, and people pick that up without being asked to do it. So that infectiousness has been really encouraging to me.
I think it was great, and I like how you're kind of using this as a learning year and deciding how to move forward. You could have something really well developed that other areas are going to want to use too. But I like how you're starting it, figuring it out and thinking about it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Barb. Yeah, ideally we would continue to expand this by a lot, including going to other cities and even other parts of the state.
You're going to have to get volunteers then.
We'd have to get volunteers, and we'd have to get more money, and we'd have to get more of people doing my job, coordinating and um, but that's all doable. The potentially financial resources could be there. Quite often in my field, what's really limiting are staff resources, just the number of people that are available to do something, especially when you're talking about insects. Yeah, but this volunteer idea is getting me excited, and I think there's real opportunity there.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us tonight, and really appreciate you taking the time to bring it all back to us, and excited to see what happens with the data over hopefully more surveys to come. So
yeah, thanks so much for having me, you guys.
yeah,
Have a good rest of the meeting.
thank you.